Okay, we are back, and we had completed part one of chapter one, and now this is going to be part two. So we had finished up with talking about the initial response to a call and some of the things that were important to arrive at a crime scene as quickly as possible. And we covered all those. But now what about, let's be a little bit more specific and talk about the actual point of arrival. So when the first officer arrives at any scene, keep in mind that the scene may be either utter chaos or it's going to be deserted. Now, regardless of the situation, the officer needs to take charge immediately and form a plan for proceeding based on the information that they have at hand. And it may not be that much information. So the actions the first responder takes at a crime scene can determine the value of the evidence for investigators and prosecutors. So, and also remember, people at a crime scene may also be excited. They might be apprehensive, and they may even be a little bit like perplexed, not sure, or confused. A lot of times they might be cooperative, and sometimes they're going to be uncooperative. Therefore, officers must be flexible and understanding, and use discretion and good judgment. Because discretion and good judgment are essential elements in any type of investigation, because the greatest potential for solving cases lie with those present at the scene, even though many of the details of the crime may not be known yet. So it's important to kind of establish those relationships, and more decisions are made in less time at the point of arrival than any other stage of the investigation. And this is when officers really are going to obtain the most leads, which is going to drive their investigation. So again, be understanding and use discretion, and because there's going to be more people there at a crime scene to help give you information. And if you're not professional, etc., you're not going to get that much information. So how do you set the priorities, being the first one at the scene? Well, circumstances at the scene typically are going to dictate what you're going to do first. But typically, you're going to want to handle emergencies first in order to achieve scene safety, because you have to secure the scene. You have to make sure that you deal with that. So handle emergencies first to achieve that scene safety, and then secure the scene in order to protect the integrity of the investigation, and then you're going to start your investigation. So those are typically three of the things, and sometimes things may dictate otherwise, where it may not be in that same order, but typically that's how you're gonna handle it. Now, when it comes to handling emergency situations, again, sometimes emergencies dictate procedure. An emergency situation, remember, causes the adrenaline to flow, and an emergency may include a dangerous suspect at or near the scene, could be a severely injured person, or even an environmental type hazard like a downed power line or a chemical spill. And any of these situations can present a life-threatening situation for the officer and other people, and their handling takes priority over other actions and situations. So sometimes, again, that emergency might dictate exactly what it is that you're going to do. So, for example, if you arrive at the scene and the suspect begins to, let's say, shoot at you, apprehending the suspect obviously becomes your first priority. Now, in other cases, a person may be so seriously injured that without immediate aid, death is probable. Therefore, such an emergency is going to take precedence over any other type of procedure. Again, unless officer safety or public safety concerns preclude that. And then finally, at some point, you're going to need to, again, secure the scene before you can get detectives and other people out there. And also good judgment. And the number of available officers may dictate what should occur first if more than one emergency exists. And sometimes that decision is a bit difficult. For example, if a person is drowning, a suspect is running away, and there's only one officer at the scene, well, the officer has to make that split-second decision, and of course, saving a life is going to take precedence over chasing the suspect. So, I mean, again, you have to kind of think about all of these different things. And we'll talk a little bit more about those as we go on. But what about the fact that the suspect might be at the scene? So if a call is made rapidly enough and the officers can get there quickly enough, they may actually observe the crime in progress and arrest the suspect at the scene. Now, departmental policy is going to determine whether the first officer at the scene thoroughly interrogates a suspect. And of course, remember, before any in-custody interrogation, remember there's two parts to that, an officer must read the individual their Miranda warning, and that's really important. We'll talk a little bit more about that in Chapter 6. And even if the policy is that officers do not interrogate suspects, officers often use discretion. For example, they may have to, let's say, take a dying declaration or record a suspect's spontaneous statement. You get there and they just blurt something out. And if this occurs, a statement needs to be taken immediately because the suspect may refuse or be unable to cooperate with you later. And a more formal interrogation and written confession, if you can get that, can be obtained later on at the police department. The suspect is also removed from the scene as soon as possible in order to minimize destruction of evidence and to facilitate questioning. So the sooner the suspects are removed, the less likely they can observe the crime scene and possible evidence that you might use against them. But again, if the suspect is at or near the scene, policy is going to determine who does the interrogation, and typically it's the detectives. And then when they do this, do not forget, for a in-custody interrogation, you're going to need to administer Miranda. Well, what about if the suspect has fled or recently fled? So if the suspect has just left the scene, you are going to have to get involved in some type of immediate action. If the information is provided early enough, other units that are responding to the scene to help out, they may be able to check the area and possibly make an arrest. As soon as practical, officers need to obtain detailed information about the suspect's possible whereabouts, their friends, a description of them, the stolen items, or any other relevant information that you can put out that's going to help other responding officers. And such information can provide insight into where a suspect might go after committing a crime. So just, kind of keep that in mind. So again, if the suspect has recently fled, you're going to need to take immediate action. If somebody is seriously injured, well, of course, emergency first aid to victims, witnesses, and suspects is often a top priority for responding officers. If aid is not already there, you are going to need to radio in for medical assistance. And then sometimes you may need to actually accompany a suspect or even a victim or a witness to the hospital if they are seriously injured. So if a person is injured so severely that he or she must be removed from the scene, attending medical personnel should be instructed to listen to any statements or utterances or anything they say that person might make for future reference, and to save all of the clothing for evidence. Now, a lot of times in these cases, if we have a victim that is severely injured and we have enough personnel at the scene, we will send somebody with that individual in case we need to get that statement and to make sure that we get whatever evidence needs to be gotten collected by medical personnel. If we don't have enough people at the scene, a lot of times we'll have an officer or a detective respond as they start to check into the scene. We'll send them to the hospital in order to meet up with either the suspect, a victim, or a witness. Well, what about if the person is deceased at the scene? So a body at the crime scene may immediately become kind of the center of attention, and even a suspect may be overlooked. If the victim is obviously dead, then the body should be left just as it is, and its surroundings protected. That's the important part of protecting or taping off that crime scene. Now, identifying the body, keep this in mind, it's not an immediate issue. Preserving the scene is more important because it may later yield clues or evidence about the dead person's identity, the cause of death, and the individual responsible. And we'll talk more about that later on in Chapter 8 and issues relating to homicide cases. But the mere fact the person is deceased, you don't need to know who they are right away. Secure the scene and let's collect the evidence properly. And in other chapters, we'll talk about that. And then finally, as it relates to the initial investigation, talks about environmental hazards. So be aware of the scene surroundings and any type of hazards that might be out there. So life-threatening emergency situations may be present at things like chemical spills, or down power lines, or things like that. So, or even explosive devices. So make sure that you are notifying the right individuals to deal with those types of things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about protecting the crime scene, because that's the next kind of thing on our list. So we talked about the first officer on the scene, and we talked about issues relating to at point of arrival, including like the emergency situations and what if somebody fled the scene, and injuries and hazards, etc. But now what about protecting the scene? So securing the crime scene is a major responsibility of the first officers to arrive. Everything of a non-emergency nature is delayed until the scene is protected. So that's important to understand. The critical importance of securing the crime scene is better understood when we talk about, and we've discussed this earlier, Lockhart's principle of exchange. And again, this is the basic forensic theory that postulates that when objects come in contact with each other, there is always a transfer of material, however so small or minute, between them. And this evidence can easily be lost if the crime scene goes unprotected. So remember part of that principle, Lockhart's principle of exchange, that there's going to be something removed or something left at the crime scene. That's kind of the summary of that. So scene security is extremely critical, and so protection from destruction or alteration is going to be necessary. So at outdoor scenes, we have to consider things like weather. And it could, it could be heat, wind, rain, snow, or sleet can alter or destroy physical evidence. Now, in addition, people can accidentally or even intentionally, disturb the crime scene. So additions to the scene can be as disconcerting to later investigation as the removal of evidence. So officers need to explain to bystanders that protecting the crime scene is critical and the public is not allowed to go in there. They're kind of excluded. And that's why we put up this tape when we do these crime scenes. And that's to secure things. And we'll talk more about these little tiles that you see some of the officers, the crime scene techs that are putting out there. And by the way, when we're doing this, just remember that bystanders need to be treated courteously, but be firm because it's important. And you have to understand that one delicate part of this entire situation is public relations, and that's dealing with the family of someone that's been killed or severely injured, etc. So a lot of times officers should explain what they're doing and why to help the family members or friends that are close to the victim understand that certain steps have to be taken in order to discover what happened and who is responsible. So, a couple of different visuals of a crime scene to make sure that we secure things and again be able to identify things. What things are important, like a cigarette butt, footprints. We're going to want some casts or photos. Could there be fingerprints on that can? The casing, there could even be fingerprints on the casing that you see there. So again, we have to think about that. Look at this wild crime scene. This was from the San Bernardino terrorism incident a couple years ago. And think of all the evidence that's left at that scene. Sometimes the crime scene is going to be very broad. And when you talk about doing crime scenes, and we'll talk about this in later chapters, you want to go big because you can always bring the crime scene in or reduce it once you've checked the area for evidence. But you can't go out because if you start too small, you've left all the other areas open and they're subject to contamination. So when you set up a crime scene, you're going to go big and then maybe shrink it down, but you can't go small and make it bigger, or at least that's not the best way to do it, if that makes any sense. You have to think about weather, on whether you have like an easy up or something, or there may be an instance where it's so raining so bad, you may have to actually pick up a piece of evidence in order to protect it. And then you're going to have to explain in your report why you did that. So it's very, very important that you do that. So before we get into actually conducting the preliminary investigation, let's just touch on a couple of other quick things on the protection of the crime scene. So crime scene protection can be as simple as locking a door to a room or a building because the scene is beyond that door. Or again, it can involve taping off or roping off very large areas. Now, within a room, chairs or boxes can be used to cordon off an area if you don't have anything else. Many officers carry tape in their vehicles for this particular purpose, or even a rope, and the tape will say crime scene or do not enter, etc. Now, officers setting up a crime scene perimeter should allow a wide enough area, as I said before, where they are confident that most of the evidence is going to be in there, keeping in mind that a crime scene can always be made smaller. However, expanding it often, proves more difficult. Now, another item of importance is that only those officers directly involved in processing the scene should be allowed inside the crime scene. A buffer area should then be established around the crime scene area where other officers administrators and myself, like when I was a police chief, or even public officials can stand at, kind of a point where everybody can be at, but they're outside of the crime scene. And also outside of that crime scene area, in that buffer area, or even outside of the buffer area, is where, let's say, the public and the media can be allowed. So it might look like maybe 3 different levels. You have the inner crime scene, maybe the buffer area, and that outer scene, outer roped off area where you can have, let's say, the media, etc. So, sometimes other officers arriving at the scene can also cause some issues by not paying attention to the warnings or the barriers. So again, a lot of times you need to train your officers that responding to certain calls, be careful as they're arriving so they don't run over evidence or run over the broken glass that was part of the crime scene, or get a shell casing stuck in the tire tread, or something like that. So regardless, an officer needs to be stationed outside of the crime scene in order to maintain security. And that's a real important thing to do. Sometimes, if you don't have enough officers, you could even get a citizen volunteer, a police department volunteer to do that. But typically, we like to have a sworn officer do that if at all possible. So now that we're going to talk about conducting the preliminary investigation, we're not, again, this is just kind of superficial. So we're not going to go through every single piece. But after all the emergency stuff has been dealt with and handled, and the crime scene is secured, the actual preliminary investigation can start. And this includes several different steps. And the order of these steps depends on the specific type of crime and the type of evidence, and of course witnesses available. Now, here's just kind of a quick overview of the responsibilities during the preliminary investigation. And again, I'll let you go back and you can read each one of these individually, but we'll cover them. So the first one is going to be questioning. So again, as early as feasible during the preliminary investigation, it's going to be necessary to, determine whether a crime has been committed, etc. So that's going to be important. And officers, need to, observe the condition of the scene, and talk to the person that called as soon as possible. And after discussing the offense, kind of what's going on, they're going to have to start to figure out what course they're going to take in all of these steps, and which one of these steps is going to be done first. So we have questioning of those around the witnesses, let's say. We have what is known as the neighborhood canvass, which is where you're going to send some investigators up and down the block, let's say, to talk to folks living in the area to see if they heard or saw anything. Part of this preliminary investigation is going to be measuring and photographing. And sometimes officers will do this or investigators will do this, and sometimes they have special individuals, the crime scene techs, that will come out and do a lot of this as well. So it depends on the size of your agency. Next would be, we talked about, measuring and photographing, and videotaping and sketching. Next would be searching for evidence. And then next would be processing that physical evidence. And again, typically this is done by having an evidence technician or a crime scene technician do it. And then, of course, recording all of the statements. So these are certain steps that are going to be done in that preliminary investigation. Now, one thing that needs to be talked about is the police and the media. And part of that is going to involve establishing a kind of a command center. So in complex cases involving several officers, sometimes there's the need for this command center. And this is where information about the crime is gathered and reviewed. And this command center is going to, again, receive summaries of communications, police reports, autopsy reports, lab reports, results of interviews, updates on discovery of evidence, etc. And personnel at the center keep a lot of times files of news releases and news articles, and prepare orderly chronological progress reports of the case for command staff and other field personnel. And a lot of times those folks that are there that want to know what's going on is going to be the media. So one thing that we need to know is a term called symbiotic relationship. And when you talk about the police and the media, they have this symbiotic relationship. It's a close relationship. And this relationship exists between the police and the news media. And what it means is that while they depend on each other, sometimes they view things different, which causes them to be a little bit at odds, because the news media wants the story and the police want to protect a lot of the information, because we don't like to put a lot of things out because our investigation is still ongoing. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So again, despite the need for cooperation, complaints from both sides, the police and the media, tend to be prevalent. Again, reporters complain that police withhold information and are sometimes uncooperative. And the police, in turn, complain that reporters interfere with the case, and a lot of times they sensationalize the case. So it is important that the media and the police understand and respect each other's roles. So at any major crime scene or during any major investigation, the media is going to be looking for those human interest stories. And the media basically serves the public's right to know within legal and reasonable standards, a right protected by the First Amendment, by the way. Now, the public, they're always hungry for news about crime, right? I mean, come on, otherwise the news would be boring, and that's the news that sells. Now, the police, on the other hand, are responsible for upholding the 6th and the 14th Amendment guarantee of a right to a fair trial and the protection of a witness, a victim, or even a suspect's rights, and a person's right to privacy. Now, this often necessitates confidentiality. And going a little further, making some information public, it actually could impair or destroy an investigation. So, and then one other thing just to think about, sometimes the police are going to rely on the media because we want them to disseminate news about wanted suspects or witnesses. So you can see that we have this symbiotic relationship, right? Where we need them, but we don't always agree with them. Now, in a lot of cases, a lot of information is going to be disseminated by the use of what we call a PIO, and this would be a public information officer. And these individuals are trained to basically interface with the media. Some departments might assign a high-ranking officer, at the time of an incident, or use a written press release. And still others allow virtually any officer in the department to talk to the media, but typically it's going to be that press information officer. And then keeping in mind, we also have other individuals at the scene, like a victim service advocate, or things like that. So we do have a lot of resources But at the same time, again, it is always better to have that PIO, that all information regarding the investigation go through the press information officer. Okay, so as it relates to our incident review and solvability factors, talking about critical steps in managing an investigation. So after the preliminary hearing, or the preliminary investigation has concluded, a review of the incident is conducted to determine whether the information gleaned thus far warrants further investigation. And this screening process is going to eliminate from the investigative workload those cases with a low potential for being solved or determined to be unfounded. And police departments typically use a screening method in order to maximize the effectiveness of their investigative and uniformed personnel. So, you know, a lot of times law enforcement agencies are going to have a process, if you will, when they get cases to investigate. So these may not be these cases that are happening right away, but these are steps in managing criminal investigations. So the types, you know, a lot of investigations come in. How do they figure out which one to work first? So this process that I spoke of, again, it you know, police departments use this case screening as a way to maximize the effectiveness of their investigative and uniformed personnel. A critical need in light of, you know, costs right now. And it's interesting to note that even 4 decades ago, law enforcement agencies were seeking ways to better utilize their limited resources in an effort to enhance productivity and effectiveness on tight budgets. Now, again, many departments screen investigations with a form that tends to ask specific questions. And if the answers to these questions are negative, the department either gives the case a low priority for assignment or does not really assign it at all. And factors that are considered when deciding whether to keep a case open or pursue an investigation further, these are called solvability factors. So again, we're not talking about response to a homicide scene and conducting a homicide. We're talking about how do detective units manage their cases. And they do that, again, you know, the goal is to maximize the effectiveness. They do this by having a form that asks specific questions, and some of the questions are called solvability factors. These are elements of information relating to the crime that are known to increase the likelihood of that crime being solved. Now, among the most important solvability factors would be the existence of one or more witnesses and whether a suspect can be named or at least described and located. Now, other factors might include whether a vehicle can be identified, if there's any physical evidence present, if there's any distinguishable MO. Remember, we talked about MO, so that's not why they committed the crime or the reason, it's the pattern. And even whether crime analysis, another unit of the department, can help identify the suspect. The gravity or the type of the offense and the possibility that the suspect may be present is it, and continue with that serious threat to others is also a factor. So if you have a murder suspect on the loose, definitely, well, that's another factor, even if we don't have a suspect yet or that much information. So, part of this whole thing is whatever the case, or whatever path the case investigation takes, an investigator must maintain accurate, thorough, and up-to-date documentation for every step from the initial report of the response to a crime through the various stages of the investigation up to and including the final disposition of the case. And sometimes they actually have some case management software. This used to be done by having a lot of paper files, but now that we're in the tech age, there's a lot of different case management software systems out there. So what about follow-up investigations? So we've talked about crimes in progress and first response. We've talked about, how do we manage the caseload? And we talked about these solvability factors. Well, now let's look at the follow-up investigation. So preliminary investigations that satisfy all the investigative criteria do not necessarily yield enough information to prosecute a case, right? Sometimes we have a case, but we don't have enough details yet. Now, despite a thorough preliminary investigation, many cases are going to require some follow-up, a follow-up investigation. And a need for a follow-up investigation does not necessarily reflect poorly on those officers who conducted the preliminary investigation. Often, factors exist that are beyond the officer's control. For example, weather can destroy evidence before officers get to a scene. Witnesses can be uncooperative, and evidence might be weak or non-existent, even though you did a great, thorough preliminary investigation. And other times, new information or evidence may come to light at a later time, and now it's going to require some follow-up. So the follow-up phase kind of builds on what was initially learned. So this is adding a little bit more. And investigative leads that may need to be pursued, including, let's say, checking the victim's background, talking to informants, following up on leads provided by the public, determining who would benefit from the crime, etc., looking at MOs. These are all things that have, that you may have to follow up on. And these are all these investigative leads that might come in afterwards. So the follow-up phase, again, it builds on what has already been learned. And sometimes we even go as far as having like a cold case unit. And different departments, again, depending upon the size, might have more investigators. So here's some information. Rialto Police Department has a cold case unit. And it's a couple of investigators that they pull these old cases off the shelf, and they re-examine all of the information, and they rework the witnesses, redo the interviews, try to find additional up-to-date information to possibly bring another case to justice, if you will. Cold cases are those that have, it's kind of unsolvable at the time because all the leads have been exhausted. But again, the officers will go back through and work these cold cases to see if there's any new information. And a lot of times some of the information might be helped or brought forth because now we have a lot of different technology. But let's look at some of the technology-aided investigation tools. So we have what we call GIS, or Geographical Information Systems, and these are crime mapping systems, or hotspots, if you will. So computers and these type of systems have significantly affected police operations. The role of computers in law enforcement and criminal investigation has evolved from being kind of a nice thing to have, oh hey, this is cool, to a kind of a must-have, an essential tool. And one of the biggest advances in computer technology came back in 1994 when then Chief William Bratton implemented the CompStat program in New York, and that's computerized statistics or comparative statistics program. And from the beginning, CompStat was hailed as a innovative managerial type paradigm in policing. It was a information-driven, kind of a data-driven strategy that stressed accountability at all levels in that police hierarchy. And it was built on 4 different principles: on accurate and timely intelligence, on rapid deployment of resources, on tactics, and follow-up. And all of this information was gleaned from GIS, or data mining, which is sifting through information, kind of narrowing the field of suspects, if you will. And there are a lot of different case management systems that are out there that help law enforcement do these different things. This is actually the department I worked at has this. It's called Crime View. And if you work a certain neighborhood, you can pull up, let's say, burglaries, and you can look at all the burglaries in your area. And you can look here. These are hot spots. And the redder the area, the more crimes that have occurred in a certain area. And it can be time of day, day of week. So you can basically break these down and you can figure out where all these burglaries are happening, what day of the week they're happening the most. So you have location, the day of week, and even the time of day. So this is a great tool for not just frontline police officers, but investigators as well. So, I think it's important that we really understand a little bit more about this information. But we talked about, crime mapping changes the focus from the criminal to the location of crimes. And hotspots, again, they talk about where most crimes occur. And data mining. To be effective, investigators must know how to kind of sift through all the mountains of available information and find the data that pertains to their case. And that's a process called data mining. And this is another element in a police organization. A lot of times law enforcement agencies will have what we call crime analysts, and their job is to do a lot of these techie things that I'm talking about. So what about community policing? And I think that we're going to finish up with this, and we'll talk a little bit about task forces, and then we'll be done for the day. But what about community policing? Well, how does that fit in? Well, community policing is aimed at solving persistent community problems. And part of the philosophy and strategy of community policing is to identify, to analyze, and respond to certain problems. And it is used in criminal investigations in many ways. And it basically, we talk about combining problem-oriented strategies with traditional investigative techniques in order to make this work. And again, part of the strategy is basically having these relationships and developing liaisons with the community in order to focus on policing. So we talk about community policing. We talked about, and this includes uniform patrol and dispatchers and prosecutor staff, defense counsel, corrections personnel, social services, physicians, the coroners, the medical examiners, the forensic lab, and then the citizens, the witnesses, and the victims. And these are all important entities within themselves. but having that bridge is really important. So, and I'll allow you to look at each one of those pieces individually, so you know exactly which piece kind of fits in and what they do. But a couple of them that I want to talk about very, very quickly would be patrol first. So remember, patrol officers are a vital component of the investigative process because they are, again, usually the first ones to arrive at a crime scene, and they have the opportunity to observe the scene before any disturbances occur. And uniform officers are also the first to deal with the victims. And because of that, they are in a unique position to develop trust with those people involved. Now, talking about physicians, coroners, and medical examiners. Well, if a victim of a crime scene is injured and a doctor is called to the scene, of course, saving lives take precedence over all aspects of the investigation. However, the physician is there for emergency treatment, not to protect the crime scene. So investigators must, again, take every possible precaution to protect the scene. And we've kind of talked about that a little bit. Now, the coroner or the medical examiner is called if the victim has died. And the coroners and medical examiners have the authority to investigate deaths to determine whether they were natural, accidental, or the result of a criminal act. And they can also provide information about the time of death and the type of weapon that may have caused it. So you can see they're a real important to the investigative process. And then finally, the forensic crime scene labs. Well, many criminal investigations are going to involve the processing of physical evidence through the forensic lab. And all law enforcement agencies typically now have access to highly sophisticated criminalistic examinations through local, state, federal, and even private laboratories. So if you don't have your own lab, you have the access to the other ones. So again, consider and read, fill in the blanks, if you will. Take the time to look on, let's say, pages 28 through 30, and look at some of those other areas and see how they are interrelated to conducting criminal investigations. A little on task forces. So a lot of times it's necessary for many crimes, specifically those involving, let's say, drugs and gangs and terrorism, to form these task forces. This is a multidisciplinary approach, and typically it's a multi-jurisdictional type investigation. A lot of times it will involve either metro crime teams or special investigative units, because these are, in fact, let's say, large, major crime organizations that the law enforcement agencies are targeting, and they need to bring all these investigators together. Another point would be to consider that police budgets, because sometimes they are shrinking, and because of some of the complications of modern day criminality, these task forces have become necessary because you have the different experts coming together. You have a bunch of officers from all these agencies coming together. And that really does help as it relates to some of these major case task forces. As it relates to federal law enforcement, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but federal law enforcement agencies can provide numerous resources to aid local and state agencies involved in high-profile cases. For example, the Department of Homeland Security, the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA. You have the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, or ATF. You have the FBI. You have the U.S. Secret Service. All of these individuals are available, or these agencies are available to help you should you need it. And where local law enforcement may run into federal agencies the most would be as it relates to bank robberies. And we'll talk about robberies later on, but because banks are federally insured, you will see the feds or the FBI come out and assist in all of your bank robbery type cases. And then if you have any type of international criminal activity, you have Interpol. So you have the International Criminal Police Organization. And they, of course, also have computerized databases to help you that is available to law enforcement agencies worldwide. So you do have a lot of different agencies. Locally, you also have, local agencies to help you. But when it comes down to, let's say, clearing or closing a case, an investigation typically ends in one of several different ways through a procedure referred to as clearing or closing your case. And following the guidelines that are set forth by the FBI's UCR, or Uniform Crime Reporting Program, an agency can close an investigation and clear an offense by arrest or by exceptional means. So again, you have arrest or exceptional means. So there's a couple of bits of info from that. As it relates to productivity, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. Productivity in law enforcement and in investigations. Again, it's more than issuing tickets. It's the utilization of investigative resources and the ability of the department to perform its job in order to safely police its community. One other point that I think is important before we're done is to talk about avoiding civil liability. So before concluding this overview of criminal investigation, it really is worth mentioning or considering what can happen if investigators, let's say, step outside of those legal boundaries during an investigation, or if they fail to act or to uphold their full legal responsibility. And some might think that the worst case scenario is that the suspect is going to, walk or get off. But that would be only part of the bad news. The other part would be that the investigator finds that the shoe is on the other foot, or that, in fact, he or she has become, let's say, a defendant in a civil suit. Now, civil liability, by definition, refers to a person's degree of risk of being sued, and officers must face the unfortunate reality that being sued sometimes goes with wearing the uniform. So just kind of consider that, because there's a lot of aspects of police work. There's, high-speed pursuits, and there's use of force, and there's even rendering aid. And all of these are subject to lawsuits. And then there's other issues that we have to kind of consider. But again, that's just kind of an overview as it relates to civil liability. So kind of in summary, as we wrap up, and it looks like we're going to make it under the 60-minute mark, so that's great. Remember, determine whether a crime's been committed. That's an important part of the investigative process or the first response process. Remember, legally obtaining sufficient information and evidence. Your job is to locate and arrest the suspect and also to recover stolen property. But it's also to present the best case possible to the prosecutor. And it is important, the cooperation and the coordination of efforts that are required outside of the police department as well as inside. And that criminal investigation is indeed a very, very mutual effort. So with that being said, that's going to conclude our Part 2 lecture on Chapter 1, talking about, an overview, just an overview of criminal investigation. So with that being said, that will conclude our part 2 lecture, and until next time.